1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Rob Mann. With his wife, Genevieve Mann, Rob is the owner and vigneron at Corymbia, which grows wines in Western Australia's Swan Valley and Margaret River. We talked about break-free tractor manoeuvres as an 8-year-old, how a budding Billy Elliot learnt to dance to the beat of his own drum, bowling over your school friends by being mates with Aussie greats like Dennis Lilly, maintaining harmony in a husband and wife working relationship, growing up as grandson to a dead-set legend of Australian wine, banishing the Dark Lord and learning to love wine again, a South African Chenin Blanc epiphany in the Napa Valley, and the quest to craft divine examples of the only wine tolerated in heaven. I started by asking about the time when this man was but a boy.
My childhood was in the Swan Valley. I grew up with my mum and dad, an elder sister, a younger brother. One of the key things I remember is how close our family was, particularly my uncle and auntie and my father, as well as my grandparents. So every weekend, every opportunity, we would be at my auntie's winery, Lamont's, mucking around at my uncle's house, which is now the Mann winery, or more often than not, based at the Horton property with my grandma and grandfather, Angela and Jack. One of the reasons we spent a lot of time with them is my dad was a professional cricketer. He played for Australia and Western Australia, but when I was young, he was playing occasionally for Western Australia, so we'd go away on trips, and that would mean we'd get to go to our grandparents. And the old property on the Horton Vineyard, which is where my family were winemakers from 1910 to 1972, my grandfather and great-grandfather. This property and the house on it meant a great deal to my family with its history. So I get to grow up spending lots of time with my grandmother and grandfather. My grandfather was a passionate cricketer, so we always played cricket on the back veranda every time. No matter how old he was, we'd drag him out there and he would love to do it. We hunted, we grew vegetables, we cooked. We used to love going to my grandparents' place. Equally, I was fascinated by my auntie's winery at Lamont's, and from a very young age, I would help out. Particularly, remember the winery setup was something that was, created by my grandfather using essentially big concrete pipes put on their end. They were about nearly 2 meters wide. They were wax lined. Everything was done by gravity. He created a press with a big long jarrah beam with a 44-gallon drum on the end, which would slowly press the grapes within this open fermenter. And I just remember the smells and the excitement of vintage from a very young age, and loved to be able to stick my nose up and smell the ferments. I was responsible for, on occasion, driving the old international tractor to empty the grape mark. My uncle would, after finished pressing, he would jump in the open fermenter. I would back the international tractor up with a scoop on the back. He would shovel over the top into this scoop, and my job was to then take it out and dump it on the lemon orchard. The challenge was coming back the tractor, and considering I was 8 years old or 9 years old, the tractor had no brakes. So you had to do this quite intricate maneuver where you would come down the hill, angle back up. When you reached the pivot point, you would then flick it in reverse and then back into the winery without any use of brakes. So as a 9-year-old, I was particularly terrified, but I don't know, I guess he said, this is the only way to learn. So I just loved it. Loved the smells and the flavors and the excitement of harvest. So there are a few of my memories from a very young age, but it built in me a love of food through my grandmother's cooking, my mother's, my auntie, a love of wine and a real interest in wine. We could sit around the dinner table and my grandfather would pull out a bottle of wine that he made, 30 years ago. And of course, being from a winemaking family, we would always have a glass with a little bit of wine in the bottom topped up with water. But, when it was a special wine, we got to taste the wine properly. And he would always remember these amazing details about the particular vintage, what the weather was like, what happened in the cricket, how many wickets he took for the Middle Swan Cricket Club. And so we were just enamored by the detail that sprung from discussing a wine that someone had made 30 years ago and being able to show them to their grandchildren. And the ultimate wine, of course, was at the end of the meal. It would be time for dessert, and that's when the scoop of vanilla ice cream and a drizzle of 1936 liqueur Frontenac would be poured over the ice cream, and it was, as my father would say, it was heaven on a stick. And that particular wine was probably, I would think, my grandfather's greatest winemaking achievement. And he used to simply label the bottles as AND, and AND was Angela Navira Dulett, so his wife, and he labelled it in honour of her. So you go and find a bottle of AND 36 basically out in the garage, and that's what we would have on ice cream and be able to have this sort of multi-generational discussion over simply a glass of wine or wine served on ice cream. So that really stuck with me, as this importance of being able to pass on your philosophies, your grounding, what's important in life through having a glass of wine and sharing a meal. So that's remained really important for me today, and something we try really hard to pass on to our kids.
It's easy to imagine that being so immersed in all of that the world of growing fruit and making things was something you might never have imagined that there was anything else, that you might escape it or even want to. Was there a time where you thought that sport, following in your father's footsteps, cricket might be a thing as well?
Well, I love sport. My family were very much into sport. My father obviously set a strong example, and it was my sister and I's weekend job to run the scoreboard at Midland Guildford Cricket Club for the A-grade team. So we were in and around great sporting icons, Dennis Lilly, we called Uncle Dennis, Rod Marsh, John Inverarity. These are all amazing cricketers, and we're all great friends of my father and my family. So I love to go to school and tell people that I hung out with Dennis Lilly on the weekend. And to that extent, I was in those brief moments, the champion of the school. That's what I felt, having this contact with these great cricketers. Before I was 10, my sister was very much into ballet, and somehow I got convinced to go and join the ballet school. This was from about age 6 or 7 years old. And importantly, it wasn't classical ballet, it was jazz ballet, and even more importantly, it was an all-boys jazz ballet school. I was obviously terrified of any contact with women or girls, so an all-boys ballet school sounded pretty cool to me. And I did it for 3 years and loved it, to the point where my friends said, "Oh, what are you doing after school today?" I said, "I'm off to jazz ballet." And then the beatings and ridicules and et cetera would happen. And it quickly became obvious that maybe doing ballet as a young boy was not the done thing. And despite loving it, decided not to go anymore. In retrospect, giving up ballet, giving up brass instruments, giving up things due to peer pressure had built sort of a resilience in me as an elder teen to really want to just go my own way and do my own thing, and try not to be so influenced by maybe negative comments that my mates or my peers might be saying about what I'm doing. So I think that's been a good lesson in life to just really stick to what you love and what feels right, and try as hard as you can to resist the pressures of external factors.
At that stage, when your father was obviously enjoying fame and you were getting a bit of deflected fame in the cricket world, was there a sense that your grandfather, Jack, was already a name? Did you have a sense of that outside of Swan Valley, or was it just that your grandfather was interesting and did cool stuff?
It was very clear to us that Jack was a well-known and well-regarded individual within Western Australia. We would always be told the stories about all the famous people that would come to Horton to visit him. The early 1960s West Indian cricket team all came to Horton and had lunch on the back veranda and played cricket on the turf wicket that my grandfather had created on the back lawn. So we were always told these stories about Sir Garfield Sobers bowling on the back lawn. All of these opera singers, famous people from all around the world, because at that time in the 60s and 70s, there weren't many wineries in Western Australia, and Horton was just outside of Perth. So if people came to Perth and wanted something culturally significant to do, then a trip out to the Swan Valley and to Horton might be on the card. So they would visit my grandfather at the winery, be shown a great time, and as kids we would be told about all these fabulous stories. So even as growing up, when I started to get interested in becoming a winemaker, it would be, oh, you're Jack Mann's grandson. Oh, okay. He was important. We know something about him. There was always a reverence to Jack's achievements. I think he travelled outside of Western Australia once in his life. He was in one of the most isolated wine regions in the world, and he achieved amazing things from one of the hottest wine regions in the country. So from that perspective, he was always sort of fighting adversity, but achieving through optimism and innovation, and obviously had a really good and sound palate. But his commitment and passion for West Australian wine really helped to define and create the opportunities that we now enjoy in places like Margaret River and Mount Barker and the Great Southern. That, you know, much of that was inspired by the work Jack did in promoting the development of the West Australian wine industry, and the help he gave to everyone who asked for it to be able to make better wine and grow better grapes.
Yeah, and as you say, your uncle as well, working in Swan Valley, and you also helped your father plant a vineyard when you were pretty young too.
Yeah, so my uncle was really important winemaker in Western Australia, and not just a winemaker, he was the state government enologist in the 1960s, and he helped a lot of particularly the early Swan Valley producers sort of modernise their equipment and modernise their winemaking, as well as pioneering the establishment of vineyards, the first vineyards in Mount Barker, in Franklin River, many of the first vineyards in Margaret River. That was Doran providing the technical expertise. Jack provided a lot of the sort of inspiration, you know, you must plant Cabernet and Riesling. But Doran was, you know, working with the ag department, the guy that was actually helping people with, you know, this is actually how you set up a vineyard, this is how you create a rootling, this is how you plant a vineyard, and then going on to say, well, technically this is what you need to make the wine, and this is how we can help you to do that. So in that sense, Doran was also really important in the early establishment of the wine regions in WA outside of the Swan Valley. And he went on to plant the Sandalford vineyard in the early 1970s, which at the time was the biggest commercial vineyard in WA, on one of the best gravel hilltops in Margaret River. And that vineyard today is a really important resource of fruit for the region. So yeah, a lot of sort of proud history. In my little stint at Cape Mentelle, which was about 10 years, speaking to David Honan and Doran. Doran was the guy that was asked to go and look at the properties that the Honans had, and I, you know, basically recommend where they should plant vineyards on that property in 1970 and what varieties they should plant. And, you know, for me, working at Cape Mentelle 30 years later, that was a really lovely link back to my family.
Swan Valley, give us an idea. We'll speak a little bit more about Corymbia's involvement there, but just about the history of wines there. You've alluded to some of the styles that were there, but back in the days when you were growing up, what was Swan Valley known for in terms of its grape varieties and styles back then, and what evolution have you seen in that?
Yeah, well, the Swan Valley being basically just on the outskirts of the metropolitan area, much like the Hunter Valley, it was established as a wine region to supply fortified wines to the early colony, essentially. And the Swan Valley for many years was a warm region producing ports, sherries and the like for domestic consumption in the Perth area. To that end, we had the Swan Valley a lot of Italian, Croatian, Dalmatian immigrants following the gold rush. They came in a large part to build the railroad out to Kalgoorlie. Many of them stayed on, particularly set up smaller vineyards in the Swan Valley. So that's a really important part of the history of the Swan Valley, is this very strong sort of Southern European influence. But essentially it was a fortified producing region, one principal winery and a few others, and then a lot of backyard businesses making traditional wine for their families. So the modernisation happened probably from the 1970s onwards, but one of the great innovations was Jack creating Horton's White Burgundy in 1937, which was a table wine in 1937 in an era when, you know, fortifieds dominated. His success in doing that was his use of a sterile filter, essentially. He was the first person to import a Seitz filter from Germany into Australia. God knows how he found out about it in 1937, but being able to filter his White Burgundy, which was a Chenin Blanc based wine, gave it stability, gave it the ability to be transported. And shortly after, that wine was, you know, available in Sydney and Melbourne markets, and was sort of the start of the sort of dip into table wines. And that wine became very successful particularly in the Australian context, lots of people have memories of trying Horton's White Burgundy as some of their first wines. But today, fortifieds are still an important part of the Swan Valley, but very much a minority. There's some of the most amazing wines in Australia are Swan Valley fortifieds, but the market is somewhat diminished these days. So in our work with Corymbia, one of the things we wanted to do is not from a commercial perspective, but from a holistic and multi-generational perspective, was keep making fortifieds. My auntie at Lamont's always made beautiful fortifieds. And so when we started making Corymbia, one of the first things we wanted to do was to make a floor-style, Manzanilla-style sherry, which my grandfather was always very successful at. My grandmother always had a glass of dry sherry in the evening. My auntie made a beautiful dry sherry, so we started making that. It's quite a complicated and technical wine to make, so it presented some nice challenges. And so we've been making that for some time, and we're given access to a small vineyard purely by chance. A gentleman heard or read in the paper that I'd come back from the US and was making wine in the Swan Valley. He said, I've got this little block of Pedro grapes. Thought you might be interested in coming to have a look at it. And so it ended up being a block of Pedro planted in 1899.
Wow.
On the original Horton property, about 1 acre. The vineyard was somewhat in disrepair, so I took on the management of that with my wife, Genevieve, and we've been farming that since we got back from the Napa. And we've been producing about 1 barrel of essentially liqueur Pedro Ximénez every year, and that's sitting in our shed waiting to be 20 plus years old before we could release it. So that's what I would consider a multi-generational project without any hope of ever having a financial return, but the fact of making a wine from a vineyard that my great-grandfather made the wine, my grandfather made the wine, my uncle made the wine, my auntie made the wine, and now we're farming and making the wine ourselves across 4 generations. That's pretty exciting, something that only the wine industry can give you, and maybe in Western Australia, only the Swan Valley can provide that sort of history.
Yeah, it's very cool reaching that far back in time and dragging it forward so other people can enjoy it and contemplate it. And also that wine, the floor wine, I remember from the most Aussie sounding grape you could possibly imagine, Sharana.
Sharana, yeah. A cross between Shiraz and Sultana. I know everyone laughs and thinks that's hilarious, but it was actually a variety created by the CSIRO, a cross between Shiraz and Sultana, created for the dried fruit industry to create essentially vine dried sultanas, which could be machine picked and made into dried grapes. The Swan Valley's other viticultural history is in dried fruit. A lot of currants and muskets, etc., were grown in the Swan Valley for dried fruit. And our vineyard in the Swan Valley was actually an old currant vineyard, and our neighbour's vineyard likewise. And yeah, my direct neighbour has 1 row of Sharana planted as an experiment, which they've still got. When I went to taste the grapes, it immediately reminded me of a variety called Madeleine, which is actually grown in Switzerland, a very early ripening grape variety. It was grown in the Swan Valley as a table grape to be able to hit the market just prior to Christmas, so you could have fresh grapes for Christmas. Seedless white grape variety, very delicate, fine, very low phenolic variety. And that was what my grandfather used to make his floor sherry from. And so this variety Sharana reminded me of that grape, and that was kind of the inspiration behind us trying to make a floor style wine. So yeah.
And so deeply involved in grapes and wine from so young, I suppose you probably don't really differentiate from your time being a family member, amateurishly, I suppose, involved in it, to the beginning of professional Rob Mann wine growing experience. But how did that translate from, I suppose, growing up in that and then starting to become a future wine grower?
Well, my early years I used to work weekends at Lamont's. It's the first and only job I've ever been fired from my uncle. I used to love it, and I was somewhat mortified that I'd be fired from a job as a 12 or 13-year-old, not really for something that I did, but for what someone else did in the winery through a lack of performance. And that stuck with me for the rest of my life. I said, I'm never getting fired ever again, particularly not by a family member. So that built a real drive in me to try to impress and perform as a worker. The other key factor in that was when at university, I spent a lot of time with the Glatzes in the Barossa Valley. Ben Glatz is a very close friend of mine, and we would spend all of our weekends, much of our weekdays, working in the winery in the Barossa Valley. And from Ben, I learnt this amazing work ethic. No one in wine works harder than him, and I didn't want to be left behind, so I had to keep up with him. And it sort of instilled a real, not competitive, but when I'm in the winery, I want to get as much done as I can and be the most efficient. I want to be the best forklift driver. I want to clean the floor better than anyone. I want to get that press dumped before everyone else. A lot of that's come from that sort of early competition with Ben in the Barossa to try and get as much done as fast as we could and as good as we could. So they're sort of two things that sort of built a kind of a drive in me to work hard and try to work efficiently and be the best in the winery. And that's purely from an operational, from a cellar hand perspective, not from winemaking. So I always said when I'm in charge of a winery, I want to be able to be an expert in everything that happens in a winery. So when there's a filtration job, when there's a technical job in the winery, I need to be able to explain to people exactly how I want it done through experience, not through reading a book or reading an SOP. So I made sure I was competent in everything that happened in the winery, and I loved working in the winery, loved being a cellar hand. Not that I got to be a cellar hand for very long. When I graduated, it was the late 90s, big boom in Australian wine, basically my whole graduating year, which might have been 15 or 18 winemakers, all walked into winemaking jobs straight away. And, my first job was in charge of 12,000 tonnes of fruit from the southeast in, Pathway, Coonawarra for the brand new Stonehaven winery. This is as a 20-year-old. There you go. Off you go. Good luck. Sink or swim.
Well, there you go. That's the challenge. That's the challenge you've been preparing yourself for, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but I was quite fortunate in that I'd been working in the Barossa for the last 2 years of university, so I was quite adept at working in a winery. And there was a few others in my year that also had really good hands-on winemaking experience, but I would say that the majority of people had maybe worked one vintage. Suddenly they're in charge of actual responsible winemaking, and winemaking is not something that you can really learn at university. It's something that you learn by physically doing it and physically stuffing it up and learning from your mistakes. And there were lots of mistakes made in those early days, particularly by me, but you learn from them and you become better.
Well, we've talked a few times about your talented cohort at Hardy's when you started. You said you're a competitive person, but you had plenty of bright people, not perhaps some who had up to that point as much experience as you, as being through the generational wine growing thing, but also through the university experience out with Ben Glaetzer pushing yourself in vineyards. But you had a pretty, I'd imagine, competitive set of people and very competent set of people that you started with at Hardy's. Was that something that immediately, again, drove you to perform?
Yeah, well, probably my biggest early supporter was Peter Dawson. Peter Dawson was the chief winemaker at Hardy's and essentially gave me my first job at Hardy's. He'd worked many years at Horton and was very much embraced by my grandfather and would spend every Monday night at Horton having dinner with my grandmother and grandfather, and he would bring along a bottle of wine and my grandmother Angela would cook a meal and the three would sit around the table and talk about wine, what's happening in the vineyard, and Peter would be told what's wrong with all his wines, etc. by my grandfather. But I'd say to this date, one of Peter's great mentors was my grandfather. So he gave me an opportunity at Hardy's and was always a great supporter of mine. But it was probably the Tintara team at the time that really got me excited about wine, and particularly international wine. It was led by Steve Pannell. There was Simon White, who's sort of the unsung hero of Hardy's at the time, Larry Cherubino. There's this tight little cohort of people that were really passionate about wine and drank a lot of great wine. Steve Pannell, to his credit, and I don't know how he did it, but had an amazing budget to be able to buy the best wines in the world. And through Hardy's paid for it. And so every day we'd be drinking particularly lots of Rhone, lots of Northern Italian wine, Burgundies, and the Hardy's cellar was at Tintara. So all of the wine would come to Tintara, and that's where we would try all these wines. So as a 22-year-old winemaker, should we have a bottle of Rouleau? Try that because we're making some Adelaide Hill Chardonnay. I'm quite interested in, obviously at Tintara, there's lots of Grenache and Shiraz. So we tried a lot of Rhone wines. Let's try this Chave Hermitage. Let's try this Clap. Let's try all these wines. These were just on the bench daily and served as a real inspiration for the wines that we were making. So we weren't trying to make McLaren Vale wines. We were trying to make, international wines that tasted like cornas, wines that tasted like Crow's Hermitage. Like that was the inspiration. And so that defined an era in Hardy's winemaking where they were really, both in whites and reds, really defining the style evolution in Australian wine. And that showed at wine shows as well. Hardy's dominated wine shows from Chardonnays through to Shirazes through to sparkling with Ed Carr. It was a really dominant era from a wine stylistic point of view. And then not just those guys, and particularly Simon was really important for me because he and I looked after Tintara for many years together. He as the boss, and me, he was the manager of the winery and I was the manager of the winemaking. And Simon's this, I don't know, gentle giant with a beautiful palate. He saw in me this sort of bottled up energy and enthusiasm, and he kind of protected me from the politics and finances, etc., of running a winery, and just allowed me to make wine. Rob, you go and make the wine. We'll share all the vineyard stuff together. I'll do this, you do that. And if it wasn't for Simon, I wouldn't have been able to sort of progress as quickly as I did, learning how to not make bad wine. And one of the big learnings we had at Tintara was Brettanomyces, the Dark Lord. We'd seen these wines from Europe, this character, and we'd say, oh, that's just European. And we started to see this character in some of our wines, and we're like, well, maybe this is a positive. Maybe we're making our wines look really sophisticated and European. And only to find out that it's this cursed yeast that was all pervading. And it was at a time when Robert Parker wines were, Kermit Lynch had published his book. Everyone wanted to use low sulfur. And this sort of created this sort of snowball effect for Brettanomyces. And, you know, we made some amazing wines that were later to become some of our worst wines because of Brett. And so during this period, we learnt what it was. We learnt slowly how to manage it to the point where during that time making wines which you didn't really know the ultimate end of, because there was this sort of this yeast that could destroy all your efforts, I became really frustrated and disenchanted with wine. I began not liking wine. I would be served a great wine from Europe and instantly to dismiss it because of Brettanomyces. And I fell out of love with wine, particularly red wine, for some time. We put in place the protocols and understood how to manage it and could see the light at the end of the tunnel, which, you know, meant that by my last few years at Tintara were some of the best time in a winery I've ever had, where we're having the best fruit. We were making amazing wines. We were investing in the winery, building a brand new winery, red fermentation cellar. We were attracting some of the best growers to come and sell us fruit because they could see we were making good wine and we were paying a premium for that fruit. Yeah, it was a fabulous time for me to learn and develop as a winemaker.
And attracting great fruit, but also attracting a bit of attention, I guess, for yourself, because was it from that position that you were plucked to head over to Western Australia?
Yeah, Tony Jordan tapped me on the shoulder and said, I'm the boss of essentially the Moet and Chandon properties in Australia, which includes Cloudy Bay in New Zealand, Cape Mentelle in Western Australia, and Domaine Chandon in Victoria, and we'd like you to come and make the wine at Cape Mentelle, which I knew I had this sort of small family history with. I knew Freya Honan really well, good mates with her. I always wanted to scratch this itch about making great Cabernet. And I figured if I'm going to do that anywhere, and if there was a shortfall of Tintara, it was our Cabernet resource. We had lots of Cabernet, but not great Cabernet. And so in my family, the holy grail is to make a great Cabernet. My grandfather famously said it's the only grape variety tolerated in heaven. It was what he encouraged everyone to plant in, you know, Mount Barker, in Franklin, in Margaret River. So this was my opportunity to come home and to really knuckle down and learn and make a great Cabernet. So I took that opportunity in 2005, and I would have been really happy to stay at Tintara for a long time because I was the head winemaker with this amazing resource behind me in an era where the industry was really buoyant and forward-looking and excited, and we'd had some great successes. It was quite a hard decision to make, but ultimately moved to Cape Mentelle, which is another chapter.
Yeah, I mean, everyone talks about today how no one would ever want to leave Margaret River, but I guess in those days, South Australia really was enjoying the kind of glory days and buoyancy that we hope that it'll see again. Did it feel like you were leaving that energy behind as well, and a lot of people in the centre of, I guess, the wine universe in Australia?
Yes, in a way, but I was quite happy with what I'd learnt and what I'd contributed at Hardy's, and I left Tintara in a really good place. It had a brand new red fermentation cellar. The wines were awesome. We understood the vineyards. We understood how to manage things properly in the winery. Might have been the year I left. Every Shiraz trophy at Australian capital city wine shows was won by a Tintara Shiraz, and each wine was different. So, from that perspective, I was really proud about what I achieved at Tintara, and even more excited about the potential of Margaret River.
And so tell us a little bit about those years then at Cape Mentel, what you learned, how quickly you got to grips with it, and any sort of career highlights, I guess, that you came across during that time, or any things that you learned that you've really taken with you from that almost decade, I think it was you were there.
Yeah. Well, obviously coming into Cape Mentel from a place like Tintara, at Tintara, I think we made 270 individual Shiraz ferments a year, and then adding on all the other things. And coming into a winery like Cape Mentel where you made, 8 Cabernets and 7 Shirazes, it was a piece of cake. This is not that challenge from a winemaking perspective, but coming to grips with the vineyard assets at the time was the challenge. And Cape Mentel, like many wineries in Australia, had grown quickly in terms of planting vineyards and growing the winery. And it had quite diverse vineyard assets, lots of vineyards, but also I think at one time we worked out 22 different varieties planted across 5 different vineyards with 15 different combinations of planting densities and row widths. And so you needed specialised equipment for each different vineyard. It wasn't transferable. There was a lot of inefficiencies in it. And there was a lot of varieties that, for example, I think we could have produced more Viognier at Cape Mentel than the entire production of Australians' annual consumption of Viognier. So there was a few imbalances there. So the big thing I learnt at Cape Mentel was that I need to focus on was I spent all my time identifying underperforming vineyards, underperforming varieties, and trying to solve them, fix those problems, because they were creating bulk wine that we didn't need. They were creating low yields and high cost of production. And so really for the first 7 years, I spent all of our time and effort removing unwanted varieties, grafting unwanted varieties to other varieties. And in retrospect, what I should have done is just said, well, what's the thing that's going to make Cape Mentel most famous? And that was easy. That was Cabernet. What I should have done in retrospect was to actually go, cool, let's, rather than try and solve all these problems all at once, just focus on what's going to give us our best result and just improve the Cabernet resource, which we started doing at the end of my tenure. But if I was to look back now and if I'd done the work and replanted or created new Cabernet sites on the best sites that we had, today's resource at Cape Mentel would be exponentially more impressive than the areas that I was focusing on. So I took that lesson when I went to Newton and did things the other way around. I focused on the top end rather than all the problems at the bottom. So that was a good lesson learnt. But my time at Cape Mentel was great. A great winery, very supportive family in the Honans, even though they didn't own it at that time. It was owned by the Louis Vuitton group, working with the French. And Louis Vuitton I found really fascinating, lots of resources, but you had to really justify very well to get access to those resources. They were quite supportive of our independence, creating the style of wine that we wanted to create. So again, Cape Mentel was a really, really fun and really educational experience, something I look back with very fond memories.
And we'll talk more, obviously, about Margaret River and the fabulousness of its Cabernet when we really delve into the Corymbia story. But moving on, you just mentioned Newton Vineyard, which I gather is no more now, which must be a little bit poignant. You had a pretty good experience there as well, again, with Cabernet, really getting to grips with something and also bringing something that may have surprised Napa Valley, a place with incredible resources and know-how and vineyard potential. What was your experience at Newton Vineyard in terms of dealing with that climate, that environment, that fruit and that brand?
Yeah, well, I think at the end of my tenure at Cape Mentel, the last vintage was 2014, which was a fantastic vintage. And that was the first vintage that I, at the end of vintage, sat down and said, I think I've made a couple of really nice Cabernets that will form the basis of a really nice wine. So to that point, I'd probably been a frustrated Cabernet maker at Cape Mentel, never quite being able to nail what I was looking for. In 14, I was the closest I'd come, and then the tap on the shoulder was like, hey, we'd like you to go to Newton. I'm like, oh yeah, but I've finally made the wine I wanted to make, and now I'm off. So in that sense, at Cape Mentel, to try and make one good Cabernet, or one what I thought was a really great Cabernet, and then I was off to Newton. Newton I'd worked at in 2007, I went and ran the winery due to the previous winemaker leaving, 2 weeks before vintage. So I was sort of airdropped in, and I had a really good time. And then the opportunity came in 2014 to go back, which we ended up, my wife and 2 boys and I spent nearly 4 years there on that term. And I was really, really focused about re-engineering Newton to be something much more contemporary. And that was contemporary in my mind, not contemporary necessarily in the mind of the American consumer, but what I thought to make a bit more international style of wine. And that involved going back to the real basics, which was the vineyards. So I had an agreement with the LVMH team that we were going to replant the entire vineyard at Spring Mountain, which was about 100 acres across with 130 individual blocks planted on a mountainside. So very extreme viticulture, so a really good viticultural challenge. And that was a really important project, replanting the vineyard, but also reimagining, redefining the style of wines that we were producing. Newton famously was best known for their unfiltered Chardonnay, which was one of those wines that defined and created that 80s big, rich, mailowy, buttery, complex, lees-stirred, batonnage style of wine. So everything you could throw at it was thrown at it. So it was a big, rich, complex, textural, powerful meal in a glass. And so my challenge was, that wasn't really the wine I wanted to drink or make, but it was part of the DNA of the business. So how do we transition people from that to something that's somewhat more contemporary? And that was true of the Chardonnay and the Cabernet. So that was a really interesting exercise. So yeah, we had a really good time in Napa. Great for a young family. Well, Napa we describe to people as the Disneyland for adults. It's lots of bells and whistles and shiny things that adults like to do. But you've also got access to Yosemite, Tahoe, San Francisco, Disneyland in LA, northern coast of California, which is just beautiful. So I worked pretty hard in Napa, but we also had some really great family experiences, and my whole experience of working in the US was really positive.
And although, as you say, Cape Mentel, you have a few things that you would have done differently if you went back there, I would sort of say in a way that by this time you were, through those diverse experiences of the family, your competitive edge with Ben Glaetzer working really, really hard together, the Tintara experience, the Cape Mentel journey, both the frustrations and the fact that you had to climb, in some ways in your mind, quite a long way to get where you felt satisfied in 2014, and then the Newton challenge. That by the time, not that you would have written the script that way, but by the time you went back to start Corymbia properly from the States, you were really, really ready for that challenge and must have been pretty excited about it.
Jen and I dipped our toe in the water in 2013 when I was at Cape Mentel with taking a little bit of our Tempranillo from the Swan Valley and making it into a wine. And we left for the USA before that wine was effectively bottled or sold or anything. So we didn't have a label for it. We didn't really quite understand the plan, but we'd made a wine and from the Swan Valley, and then we shot up and left to go to the US. So while we're in the US, we were kind of managing this project where we would, come back in holidays to Australia and prune the Swan Valley Vineyard, and Jen would stay on after Christmas to make the harvest decisions and get the wine made for each subsequent vintage of that first wine, which for the first 4 years was just a Tempranillo blend from the Swan Valley. We were lucky to be part of a tasting with some really lovely friends of ours in Napa, where they'd just come back from a study tour of South Africa, and they brought back basically a dozen of their favourite Chenin Blancs that they'd tried. And we set up a tasting up at Newton. One of the best investments at Newton was this Santa Maria grill sort of fireplace that I installed, which was about the only thing that survived the bushfires in 2020. Everything else was burnt to the ground. We would often have wine tastings outside and cook a meal and try some wines. And so we tried all these Chenin Blancs from South Africa, which I'd never really had much interest in because the early ones I'd tried were not really to my liking, but maybe 3 or 4 of these wines were sort of exhilarating, fresh, textural, complex, really thought-provoking wines. And Jen and I looked at each other and said, well, man, we've got exactly the same resource of this as this in our Swan Valley Vineyard that we actually own, and no one's really doing this in Australia. So why don't we do what Swartland's done and go home and try and make a great Chenin Blanc from a region that's well suited to it, has a long history with it, lots of parallels and similarities with what's been done in South Africa. And probably Swartland's a pretty similar climate and region to the Swan Valley. So that was sort of the turning point mentally from us to be able to go, well, cool, we're making wine in Napa, to saying, well, maybe we should be doing something back in Australia. Combined with that, when I was at Cape Mentelle, I basically spent every weekend driving around Margaret River, looking at the soil maps, looking at the climate maps, looking at the 50-year climatic forecasts, the predictions about climate change, etc. And I identified some really specific areas in Margaret River where I thought I could plant a vineyard and make great Cabernet. So that took about 15 years of searching, and basically in 2017, when we decided to come home, take over running our Swan Valley vineyard, we also leased our vineyard in Margaret River, which 2 years later we ended up buying. And now today it's looking outside, it's raining, but we've got 2 hectares of additional Cabernet planted with a bit of salt and pepper of Malbec and Cab Franc, and this is where my wife and myself and our 2 boys live, on this property about a kilometre from the ocean. And we still farm our property in the Swan Valley, which is where my mum lives. So it creates its challenges, but we're really, really enjoying the challenge.
Yeah, I remember you coming to Melbourne when that deal was almost sealed in Calgardup, Margaret River, and just how utterly excited you were at the prospect of that site. I think we'd seen pictures of it, which looked amazing. The proximity to the ocean, the dirt, the atmosphere was almost palpable around the vineyard, just looking at it in pictures, but also tasting that wine, the Cabernet. You didn't quite have the resources at Tintara that might have let you explore that. Then a long journey towards it at Cape Mentelle and Newton Vineyard. And then all of a sudden, this amazing site in an amazing place that you'd scouted out, as you say, for a decade and a half. And I remember very well the first time I tasted it, and it really knocked my socks off, genuinely, and has every time it's been released. What is this sort of pinnacle Cabernet for you? How do you envisage it? How do you realize it?
Yeah, well, not such an easy question to answer. And in a sense, I always love when we talk to Pinot Noir winemakers, and it's always, Pinot Noir is the most difficult grape to grow, and it's this idiosyncratic thing. And, Pinot's grown successfully in lots of parts of the world. It has a very specific set of requirements in order to achieve that, but there's many great examples from all around the world. Cabernet, on the other hand, less successful globally. It has some very unique places where it makes truly outstanding wine. It's grown everywhere, but it excels in just a few places. So part of that is because it's a complicated, challenging, late ripening variety with lots of structure and lots of tannin. And at its worst, it can be quite offensive, and at its best, it can be the most exhilarating, inspirational wine you could ever try. So that gives you this whole palette of opportunity. And for us, the Calgardup Vineyard is, I've looked all around the world for a site for Cabernet, and this is as close to Cabernet Nirvana as you can get from our perspective, because we want to make a wine. And in terms of the winemaking philosophy, we're not trying to make a Chateau Latour Mark II. We're trying to make something that speaks of the place, but also borrows from our family history in the way we've made wine, and the style of wine that we've wanted to make. And that, to me, is something that doesn't involve the influence of oak character in the wine. And so, as a point of difference, from the beginning, we invested in some large oak vats, and the wine is essentially made in a neutral oak vat, aged in a neutral oak vat. Somewhat more like you might make a Barolo, or you might make an old school Cornas, and somewhat inspired by the way my grandfather would have made his Cabernet, which would have been made in a concrete fermenter and then aged in an old German oak cask. No new oak at all, just relying on the site and the viticultural prowess to be able to come up with something that's really exciting. So the challenge is that oak's are really good at not just complementing positive characters, but also masking some of the negative characters in wine. So making a wine this way leaves you really exposed to any potential negatives in the season or the viticulture. So that's something we really embrace, because if you've seen our labels, essentially captures a full year's climatic data within each label. And the character of the season is integral to the character of the wine. When it's a warm, dry year, we want the wine to taste like that. When it's a cooler, wetter year, the wine should reflect that to some degree. So our site, I think, is really transparent, and there's characters that we get here that are quite unique. This sort of umami, nori character that comes from being quite close to the ocean. Like we, wake up in the morning listening to the waves crashing. This is uber maritime. It's basically as close as you can get to, having your toes in the water, growing grapes. It gives us a very moderate climate. Importantly, it avoids the extreme heats that we might get occasionally. Being close to the ocean, particularly this close, gives you a real strong buffering effect from particularly those warm days. That's when you can do damage to the high notes of Cabernet. It can make the tannins quite aggressive and tough due to overexposure. So we're looking for something that's really quite seamless, elegant, characterful, distinctive, something that's not reproducible anywhere else, and something that we can own as something unique that also celebrates the beauty of Cabernet. And not just Cabernet. We'd like to think that it's more about this site. So we've got a little bit of Malbec and Cab Franc planted in the new vineyard to complement that story. But it's a really exciting project.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those hallmarks of the wine, that sort of sea spray, nori factor, the brightness of the fruit. But the tannins, I think, are really interesting in that wine as well. I wouldn't call them soft tannins because that would almost be to miss the point of the fact that it has tannins and that they're really part of the wine. Certainly, they're not aggressive, but there's a real sense of presence to them that is gentle but still assertive, something that you can't possibly miss and fail to appreciate in that wine.
Well, there's quite a few people that say the wines that Jen and I make have a certain tannic feel to them. We make the wines down in Margaret River for Swinney, and the tannin line and tannin structure of those wines is very distinct. As I think our Cabernet in Margaret River is. The wines that I love and drink from Europe, but also Australia, from the US, have this beautiful tannin spine. The structure of the wine is the most important thing. Maybe one of my criticisms of Australian wine is they're often too soft and too nice. They don't give you that complementarity with food where you want something to, if you've got a richer meal, you want something to cut through it and freshen it and liven your palate up. So even in the early days at Hardy's, I never made a wine above 14% alcohol. Never was interested. This is 25 years ago in an era where everyone was producing 15.5%, 16% alcohol wines. I feel alcohol is one of the critical things to balance in a wine, to give you this sort of cooling effect on the palate when alcohol's in balance. As soon as it gets too high, it's this warm, enriching, thickening effect, which I think you lose the grace and elegance and balance in the wine at that point, as well as the potential longevity in the wine. So getting this balance right is a real challenge in Australia. It comes down to finding the best site with the best viticulture, with the most complementary varieties, so you're not having to get them overripe to get the flavors that you want. But this focus on structure and tannin is something that that's what the key thing we look for, because we're not using any oak tannin or flavor or structure. We're just using what we get from the vineyard, from the grape. Yeah, I feel the wines often have it's not a saturated structure. The tannins are quite present, but they're not aggressive at all. They really frame the wine, give the wine what I call this spine, in which all the fruit, the acidity, the personality of the wine can sort of hang from this spine to give you this beautiful length. And Cabernet has, at its best, is the longest, the most complete, the most harmonious wine. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And maybe that's going to take some time. We're particularly excited about the new vineyards that we've put in, particularly utilising essentially fourth generation family Massal selections of Cabernet and Malbec, wines that have a real connection to us, but also they're quite individual and unique in the landscape of vineyards and clonal selections around the place. So we see the future that our wine will become, even more idiosyncratic, a little more personalised, more unique, and that's something that we really, really look forward to.
I'm always aware, I think with you particularly, when I see I suppose, press about what you're up to, the term winemaker applied to your name. And I don't know whether it irks you, because I kind of know, having spoken to you so many times over the years, that it's not what you are really. I know how much you love the viticulture and being outside. Was there really a time you feel that you became more of a viticulture person? Because obviously at Hardy's, I guess, back in its entire days, as you say, you're in charge of quite a lot of process there. How far back does it go, that sense that the land and what you're actually starting to create there is what you do as a person?
Even when you said that term, it irked me.
I saw you wince.
Yeah, I did wince. It goes back right to my youth, sitting around the table with my grandfather. My grandfather literally said at the table, no man has the right to call himself a winemaker. Nature is the winemaker, and man, if he is skilled, allows nature to perform to its best advantage. That's always stuck with me. And people often say we're not winemakers, we're more like crafts people or artists. That all sounds a bit... At the end of that, I feel I'm a farmer producing a unique product, and in all of my winemaking experience, nothing I can do in the winery is going to make average grapes taste amazing. Plenty of stuff I can do in the winery will make amazing grapes taste average, but at the very pinnacle of winemaking, the winemaking is totally irrelevant. It's 100% what's happening in your vineyard. Winemaking is important when you're making a commercial wine from 50 different vineyards. That's when you need to make wine. But at its very best, being intimate with the vineyard, understanding the exact point of harvest, understanding which parts of your vineyard need to be harvested when, having a really respectful approach in the winery to allowing the wine to express itself, to the point where we've moved away from the traditional notion of anything to do with barrel selections or keeping batches separate in the winery. We're making essentially individual batches based on harvesting and co-fermenting at the point of harvest, what we think's best. And that's the wine. We're not then blending this and that in with it afterwards. We make one or two harvest decisions, and the wine is made in the vineyard both from a growing perspective and a making perspective. And I feel somewhat liberated that using that approach gives you something more unique and individual each year than tinkering in the background and going, oh, this barrel looks a bit better, and this one, or how about we stick a bit of that variety in to cover that. No, I think understanding a vineyard and working through experience, what complements each other at the point of harvest, where you want a bit of Malbec in your Cabernet, co-ferment it rather than ferment it separately, because the beauty of co-fermentation is the resultant wine is totally different to making them separately and blending them together afterwards. The chemistry that happens in the ferment, grape to grape, creates these tannin structures, these flavour compounds that are totally unique that you couldn't get without that co-fermentation. So I think it's somewhat liberating. I'm a winemaker by trade, but I really want the vineyard to be the hero, not the winemaker. I've said to a few people, we want the wines to scream of the vineyard and whisper of the winemaker. Yeah, that's a philosophy based on sitting around a table and listening to my grandfather as a 8 or 9 year old.
You just mentioned co-fermentation, the beauty of it. We've mentioned, but only in passing really, your extremely talented, much admired wife, Jen, who doesn't tend to take the limelight at Corymbia, but is obviously instrumental. I can't remember actually when it was that you two met and where on your winemaking journey, but just, if you will, give us that fact, but also a little bit on what we should know about Jen and how you two work as a team.
So this is one of those questions laden with, potential traps, given Jen's obviously going to listen to this at some point, so I need to be really, really careful. But essentially, we met at Hardy's Tintara. She was a winemaker and I was the boss. We very much resisted any notion of any emotional connection between us, to the point where we almost avoided each other. And the point at which I decided to come back to Western Australia to Cape Mentelle, I told Jen about it and said, by the way, I've just resigned. I'm going to go back to WA. And she got quite emotional. I said, oh, this is strange. Like, normally we're in the winery trying, quite competitive, wanting to get stuff done. And here she's emotional about me leaving. So this is a bit strange. I guess over the subsequent year, we tried to establish a remote relationship, which was quite a challenge, to the point where Jen said, stuff this, I'm coming to WA. So she came in 2007, a winemaking job at Howard Park came up. So she was winemaking at Howard Park. I was at Cape Mentelle, and that was the story of how that came to be. In terms of the way we work today, I mean, Jen sorts out everything that's needed in the next 5 seconds, and I sort out stuff that's needed in 5 years. We do think quite differently. I'm always thinking about what's this vine going to taste like in 10 years' time? What are my kids going to do with this vineyard when they want to come back? Do they even want to come back? What do I do if they don't want to come back? Jen's like, guys, we need to eat. You guys need to do your homework. You guys need to put sunscreen on. We need the finances to balance. She has a very well-honed and acute palate with respect to wine. It's nice to see, she's getting some really good feedback and recognition on her wine judging at the moment, which for her is really valuable because it's something outside of just Rob and Jen, who live together, work together. It's her own space, something that she can own. But we don't always agree on the wines that we like. She's obviously always right. But we've worked out a way to live and work together and try to create a business that complements each other's talents and interests and skill set. And like I say, she manages all the detail and I drive a tractor.
Just as a last point, you mentioned the word holistic at some point during this conversation. It's a word that I guess a lot of people in wine like to think that they're thinking about a picture and how they are part of it, how the moving parts work together. I don't think many perhaps come quite as close to embodying that as you and Jen and what you do at Corymbia. I think of the label, which I think is your sister's design, the Marri blossom with the flower and all the filaments of sunshine or temperatures rather, and rainfall, and how that's part of the vineyard and the year that you're reflecting all the time, how you're always very conscious of reaching back in time and taking lessons from the places, the Swan Valley, Margaret River and the history, but of course your family's very, very deep connections with all those places. But it's obviously what drives you, I think, this connection to everything and how it's an enormous opportunity to be enriched by those connections, to honor those connections and to bring them to the surface and perpetuate them to the future.
I've always been drawn to old school wineries. I like the Craigleys and the Wendorees of the world. There's something about these producers, Yeringberg, they're grounded, they're not fashionable, they're not unfashionable. They inhabit this sort of middle ground. And when you look through the history of, it's the point around which styles and fashions evolve. They always come back to this point. I've got a couple of really good friends in Victoria, Andrew Marks at Gembrook, Simon Oscar at Paul Oscar Wines. These are multi-generational families on very individual, unique sites, and they've got this lovely grounded philosophy that their wines always taste like the place they come from. And if I imagine I wasn't here, I'd like to think that the wines that produce from our vineyards have this character that is overwhelmingly distinctive of the place and not of the people. The people is important because, I decided what vines to plant and what orientation and what planting density, so that's important, but that was really to amplify and express the potential of the site through my eyes and through my experience. So my contribution, I hope, has been positive, but ultimately we'd like to think that our vineyard sites will outlive us and will be something that would be identifiable to our grandchildren as much as they are to my children and to ourselves in terms of the style of wine they produce. So I don't really think about the economics of wine from that perspective. Is this a profitable venture? Are we making X dollars a year? For me, it's a lifestyle choice. As long as we're not destitute, we're quite happy. We'd like to be successful. I don't need to make millions of dollars. I want to make a statement about our intent as a product of our history, which is really totally unique. We find it's a really engaging story, and we want to articulate that through what we put into a bottle and be able to share that and have that conversation with people around a dinner table about what makes our wines unique and interesting. Because ultimately, you've got to sell the product. It's not the part of the business that I love, nor does Genevieve, but actually going and selling the product is what puts food on your table. But we'd like to think that people are genuinely interested and engaged in the process and seek out the wine to hopefully make our job of selling it, which is the bit that I've never been super enthusiastic about, to make that a bit easier. I think it's an exciting project. We wake up every day and look out the window, and some days it's like, oh my God, we've got all that work to do. But other days it's like, man, how amazing is this going to be in 20 years' time? But there's a bit of time between now and then.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like it, subscribe, share it with everyone. I mean it, your support makes a huge difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmarison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and to my guest, Rob Mann. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.